Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Hila Rasul, Director of Planetary Politics at New America. This is a very timely and important conversation, so I'm very happy to moderate it today. OPEC is celebrating its 60th anniversary amidst a rapidly changing global energy landscape. It is also almost exactly 50 years since the 1973 energy crisis that took place as a result of geopolitical conflicts that is not too dissimilar from what is happening today. We are well into the second year of Russia's war against Ukraine and have been facing a new kind of energy politicking, especially in Europe. And we are also just coming off of one of the more contentious COPs we have seen in recent years, mostly because of who hosted it and how fossil fuels took center stage. So lots to talk about and with an incredible panel. Today, we are joined by Amy Myers-Jaff, Director of Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab at New York University. We are joined by Kaushik Deb, Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and Carolyn Kassane, Associate Dean and Professor at the Center of Global Affairs at NYU. So again, welcome to you all. And so as we were just talking about, we have just hot off the presses received some of the final language coming out of COP28, the Conference of the Parties on Climate. There was a lot of negativity around who hosted, what their intent was, and all the oil lobbyists who came to the party. In some ways, this can be viewed in a positive light. It also exposed how climate policy has been captured by the fossil fuel industry. And honestly, I've never seen media coverage of a wonky multilateral conference in this way. So I would love to turn to each one of you for your sense on what transpired over the last few weeks. And so I'll turn and then just, the language coming out just this morning. So Amy, I'll turn to you first for, what your thoughts are on some of the language we're seeing and everything that kind of led up to this moment and what we can expect coming after it.
Well, I think a lot was made about, OPEC sending a letter and weighing in and, should they be weighing in and what is their interest? And it led to some calls that maybe having every single country in the world have to agree to every single word that comes forward might not be really what the best process is. Because at some point, this group was either going to lose the coalition of island nations and high coalition, the coalition that wants the most, highest, most ambitious action, or it was going to lose these sort of petrostates, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and so forth, who were not supportive of the phase out of fossil fuels language. And it took many days of compromise, including, having the conference run beyond the stated scheduled date for closure. And now I think there's going to be a postmortem about the process. Some people are saying this is very historic because at least there was a definitive statement about the transition away from fossil fuels, which kind of implies that fossil fuels are the problem, which, other wording might not have so categorically put on the record. Whereas other people are saying, listen, the funding that's needed to help the global South achieve the ambitious targets that were set for renewable energy was not really forthcoming. Systems, other kinds of systems that are needed were not really forthcoming. There were quite a few pledges made to the new loss and damage fund, so that could be seen as an accomplishment of the meeting, but it's still well below what's needed for countries to respond to this, terrible problem of loss and damage from the heat waves and flooding and other kind of catastrophic events we're already seeing. So I'm not sure one can give an A in the report card, even though some people are using the word historic, because there just it lacked ambition compared to what the moment might have hoped people would rise to.
Thank you. And turning to you, Carolyn, I know you've been watching the negotiations closely, and it's been hard to kind of parse out the language that's in the document that we see.
Yeah, I think Amy did a great job in terms of giving us sort of the high points or the low points, right? If you're sort of looking at the kind of, I would say it was much ado about nothing in terms of the final document specific to fossil fuels. As Amy highlighted, there was a lot of ambition around getting phase out into the document. Phase out did not happen, nor did phase down. I look at transition away from fossil fuels, which is kind of the language that was used at the kind of in the end, as already what has been kind of on the table. And when we talk about energy transition, we're talking about a transition away, of course. We're still deeply entrenched in a fossil fuel system. 80% of the world's primary energy comes from fossil energies. The Saudi energy minister this morning in an interview said, the document, the agreement really ultimately will mean nothing in terms of Saudi policy going forward, as well as I think you're going to see it across the OPEC countries, right? If we're talking about OPEC, we're talking about the United States. I think what's also interesting is, the United States, Canada, the UK, and Norway were pushing for stronger language. We're actually pushing to have phase out in the final agreement. Again, kind of going back to what Amy said, the small island nations were really lobbying very hard and quite rightly, given the impacts that they see from climate change. But the United States is seeing record high oil production this year. I don't think there's any sort of sign in the near future that the United States is going to phase down. I think we're also seeing higher production in Canada. I think Norway is also. So I thought it was very interesting that some of the countries that were sort of, at least some of the climate envoys in place representing those countries, are in fact going full throttle in their own oil and natural gas production where there is that capacity. I think for me, one of the big sort of maybe interesting highlights is the methane pledge. And I think that is something very meaningful and that will have an impact. And, you saw many, both national oil companies as well as international oil and gas companies that are committing to a pretty significant reduction in methane emissions, which is doable. It's a feasible. I think we will see it. We even saw a company like ExxonMobil that had been on the sidelines of the UN methane pledge reporting has now committed to it. So yeah, so I think that's something that I think is a plus. And a lot of the other things, a tripling of renewable energy capacity, a lot on in terms of nuclear energy. Again, I think they're great pledges. I think the realities that we're looking at in 2024 and beyond, economic realities and economic headwinds, as well as political headwinds, I think will be something that will kind of, can be part of the discussion that we have today.
Yeah, it's certainly a mixed report card. Kaushik, I want to hear from you on what your sense was coming out of COP28. And I know that you just this morning traveled back from India. And so what the energy is amongst, some lower middle income countries, some of the BRICS countries coming out of this as well.
Thanks, Hila. It's great to be here, and really the way kind of Amy and Carolyn described what came out of COP or what did not come out of COP is pretty much the best summary that you would get. Of course, over the next few weeks, there will be tons and tons of papers that will be written and lots of analysis looking at each comma and full stop and the and that's there in the draft agreement, that's there in the agreed text. But in the end, kind of a lot of it boils down to, as Carolyn was saying, Prince Abdulaziz said this morning, does it really matter? I mean, this is essentially kind of a non-binding international text, which, unless actually translated into national policies or national legislation, isn't really that material, especially when there is in every COP a very unfortunate adversarial negotiation that happens between the haves and the have-nots. In places in the global south, especially in global south, which is kind of big and emerging and not, the likes of the small island states, there is a very strong current about whether anything needs to be done in terms of climate action in a large African country or a large Asian country, especially when the gap in energy consumption on a per capita basis or an emissions basis is so vast. There is a finite carbon budget, but the question of who gets to use up the remaining carbon budget and whether the developed world needs to evacuate some space for the rest of the world to grow is a very significant part of what a country like India or the rest of the developing world feels. And that's kind of, I think, important to recognize whenever we are having a conversation like this around COP. This was my first COP after 15 years. I mean, frankly, I'd given up on this process. And essentially, kind of, it's really turned out to be, one of these climate festivals where everyone kind of comes together, has their booths, has meetings, meals. It by itself is a super emitting event by, if you kind of are
This
looking
year
at,
especially.
yeah, I mean, if you climate impacts, it's 70,000 or 80,000 people in a city, and the city did not even blink or kind of absorb that. It's remarkable. But one thing that I kind of note or that came out of this COP, which, given that this is the 60th anniversary of OPEC, is that this is possibly the only win OPEC has had this year. Despite everything that they've tried to do to manage oil markets, cut production, voluntary, agreed, forcing smaller members to take additional cuts, trying to enforce discipline in the market, they really haven't been able to do anything in terms of being able to manage oil markets. But if they've had one notional win, it's just that this one agreed text kind of reflects a lot of their priorities, which I would say is a big achievement coming out of COP for a oil producing nation.
So I think I would add one point to our discussion, just to elaborate a little bit. So the language could be material and in one community in particular. How does the multilateral agencies, development banks, and commercial banks, international commercial banks, interpret this sentence? Because had there been a clear phase down sentence, it would have been very hard for countries to get access to the capital to continue to invest in fossil fuel production and use. So the question is, I think it'll be interesting to see in the coming weeks, was the language strong enough to cast a glow of risk over the financing of new coal-fired power plants, of new oil and gas development, new LNG export terminals, et cetera. That to me is really where the language matters in signaling the sort of big players in the market, not so much countries that were going to, consider their domestic economy and are going to use their own revenue to fund what they do for their domestic economy. Because a lot of countries are not in that position. A lot of countries are needing the banks to finance what they do, or they're hoping that the World Bank or some other development bank is going to help them finance what they want to do. And whether this language is enough to have the financial institutions be able to say, this is too risky, we don't want to finance it. Because remember, if just to use a US example, but I'm sure it's true in India. In India, you have Reliance and some other big players, investing in green hydrogen now instead of in refining. So the real question is, if I'm a bank and a company comes to me in the United States and they want to finance a new LNG export terminal, am I going to be better inclined to figure that it's going to take them 5, 6, 7 years to put that online, and then I need it to be financed to pay back over many years? Is that not, now is that language sort of making that seem like it's a bad investment? Or should I be encouraging that company to do, green ammonia with those same, billions of dollars? So to me, that's where the rubber might meet the road, to use an American expression, on the wording that came from the global stock take. And then also, one has to consider people are already casting forward 2 years to the climate meeting in Brazil. and saying that we're going to be further along and we might be able to get much stronger language by then. And so, I think that trajectory issue when it comes to finance might be the most significant thing that would come out of the language from this year.
Just to highlight, though, I mean, Brazil is looking at increasing its own oil production, right? Petrobras has already put out a plan. So I don't disagree with you, Amy. I kind of share Kaushik's, a little kind of sort of somber note about, kind of the realities here. And even going back to, we've been talking about this idea of stranded assets, right? That the banks are going to stop funding fossil projects. And, I think we've seen some examples of that, but at the same time, we're seeing increased production. We're seeing China, we're seeing a lot of countries that have more coal build out. We're seeing here in the United States some very ambitious LNG projects that have, gotten the requisite funding. So I guess I'm a little bit more kind of cautious about the signaling that the agreement is going to have for the financial institutions.
I'll turn it over to Kaushik on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a kind of nuanced thing here, in the sense that, at least as far as the multilateral developmental bank system exists today, or even existed before Dubai, there was hardly going to be any World Bank or ADB investments in any kind of fossil fuels, even if it was for the role of gas as a transition fuel. I mean, that's kind of been clear in terms of their lending strategies, formally also laid down as kind of their requirements. A fantastic example to me here is nuclear. I mean, no multilateral developmental bank has kind of come forward and kind of said that we will support nuclear in any part of the world just because. And here we have a pledge with a fairly significant number of countries at COP saying that we want to triple nuclear as a way of decarbonization. And it's kind of hard to imagine that anyone from the multilateral developmental world will come and do this. Now, here is a situation where, the China-led Asian investment banks and those kind of investment vehicles could become significant. The Japanese investment, the Japanese developmental arm could become kind of significant and make that transition and make that change happen. But at least one thing that's kind of come out of this COP that's helpful for the multilateral developmental banks is that they've been given a fairly clear signal that they need to move forward in ways that they can help smaller developing countries to start de-risking green projects. And that's material, that's significant. I can kind of understand that's like way off our OPEC conversation, but that could be a game changer, especially if we are looking at a developmental paradigm where we want to increase prosperity without increasing the carbon or the energy footprint by very much.
Well, that kind of leads into my next question, because in the absence of, the MDBs getting their act together on financing the transition, we're seeing more investments continuing to go into creating more demand for oil and gas, especially in developing countries. I mean, during these last 2 weeks, we also just found out that more about Saudi Arabia's global investment plan to create demand for its oil and gas in developing countries. So this plan itself falls in line with the perception that it's not fair to expect developing countries or economies to leapfrog the use of fossil fuels in their path to development. But how much is this truly rooted in reality, and how much of it is narrative and disinformation?
So let me just say something about the sort of, not saying that the Saudis are saying this, but just in general, the disinformation, because actually the successful electrification cases on the African continent have not been natural gas and have not been oil or even coal for the most part. We've seen a huge deployment of geothermal, successful deployment of hydro across the continent, and for rural electrification, there's an increased understanding that the multilaterals and others need to come in and finance distributed energy resources, which predominantly might wind up being solar. And so, I do think there's the reality on the ground, which is countries like Kenya and Ethiopia and others are providing more universal access to electricity, literally through renewables. And the sort of storyline that somehow it needs to be fossil fuels, which is, if you take the example of Nigeria, Nigeria is one of the premier countries in Africa that has been unable, has the actually highest number of people lacking energy access on the continent. And they, of course, flare natural gas at, again, one of the top global flarers. And so I think we have to separate out each national profile and what countries can really achieve with more ambition and not, create this belief, which, was sort of backed up by, I'm not going to say who, but, backed up by the industry, oil industry in general, that somehow people will be poor if they do not have access to oil, when, that's probably not true. And what we're actually seeing, I think, is every time OPEC raises the price to a very high level, what do we get? We get repeated financial and banking crises, which of course we saw really prominently when OPEC raised the price of oil too high in 2007, 2008. But even, a year ago, one could argue that some of the regional bank failures and some of the questions about stability of European banks and a lot of the extreme debt situation that we're seeing among countries in the global south, countries that you've had countries that are not able to pay, service their debt. A lot of that actually comes from this inflated oil price and its impact on inflation, driving interest rates higher, and the corollary cycle, which just to throw it out there for your listeners, when I've written a book, Oil, Dollars, Debt, and Crises, and we my co-author Mahmoud Al-Gamal and I have systematically shown the interrelationship between geopolitical events and this cycle, showing that it's part of the cycle, it's endogenous to the cycle, it's not some thing that swoops down from the outside and throws the cycle off. And indeed, one could interpret Russia's invasion in 2022 of Ukraine as part of that constant violent cycle that comes from the amassing of oil revenues and then spending it instead of on development and health and education, other kinds of services for the population, spending it on arms, and then using those arms against the neighboring country, which is a repeating pattern we've seen, most lately by Venezuela announcing that, of course, land that has been, in their view, disputed, but the international system recognizes as part of Guyana, requires them to reclaim it.
I'll turn over to Kaushik, but I'd love to kind of pull the thread on this topic as well.
I just wanted to kind of say that, I mean, Amy is absolutely right that it's a very disingenuous comment from the oil producing countries and companies that they need to continue to produce oil and gas so that the rest of the world can develop. I mean, for heaven's sake, what were they doing for the last 40 years as the rest of the world kind of pretty much just meandered through low growth and poor, very low level
low growth that they caused. Yeah, low growth that they caused.
Absolutely. So that's an argument that I'm kind of as violently opposed to as much as I am opposed to asking developing countries, especially low income, low energy consuming developing countries, to transition to green right away.
Right. Amy, you kind of touched on this. I mean, in some ways, some could see like what happened at COP and the recent OPEC meetings as maybe not a last-ditch effort, but some show of desperation by some OPEC countries and the fossil fuel industry. Like they're seeing the kind of path. They're not too happy with it. And so they're kind of turning to these alternative strategies. But this is also kind of playing out of the geopolitical sphere as well. And so I know that you have some really interesting thoughts on, especially the last couple of years, on the changing face of conflict as a result of this kind of desperation.
So let me, put countries into different buckets. I believe that the countries of the Gulf are really well positioned to pivot to energy strategies that will be successful for them as exporters and to, buttress their economies. And I think some of those countries, whether it's Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, are starting to actually move in that direction. And I think they, quote unquote, get it on some level when it comes to their own planning, right? Where I really see the problem is when countries who do not have a strategy and who have had international power, being internationally powerful, because they were important exporters, see this transition to a potential loss of that geopolitical power over time. And to have that political power deteriorate over time doesn't mean that oil demand doesn't even have to peak per se, or we have to know, when we're going to, use the phase down language. What really only has to happen, which I think is already happening, is that when the price of oil goes up, countries have options about things they can do to decouple their economy from oil. That might be having a more aggressive program in renewable energy, as we saw Europe embark on after they had the conflict with Russia over natural gas supply. That might be, as Kaushik and others have mentioned, India also transitioning to electrification and hydrogen and, various strategies as part of their green industrialization programs. Even China, very strong green industrialization a pathway for their economy. So, it's the we could just all buy electric cars, or we could put in more renewable energy, or we did put battery storage to go with all the rooftop solar in Germany. Things that actually happen as the price of energy gets too high, that's based on fossil fuels. Those kind of steps actually do undermine how much the energy weapon would be valid. So, I get it. Russia just used the energy weapon and it looked, pretty material. But maybe they used it because they perceived that, 5 years from now or 10 years from now, they weren't going to be able to use it. And the question I think we have to ask ourselves as we look at the energy transition is, how vulnerable is the international system to a breakdown in for countries that are used to being powerful, now turning to hard power to assert themselves, where energy power is no longer going to be as effective. And, that could be Russia using its military power. That would be terrible if Venezuela would now feel free to, re-raise some conflict from, 1866. It could be Iran reasserting itself in the region through proxies, through violence. The question about what do we do to create a deterrence of a resort to hard power for countries that are petrostates, that might feel that they're losing their influence globally. I think this is a serious challenge that the United States and China and other like-minded countries that would like to see more lasting peace and less humanitarian disaster really need to focus on.
Absolutely. Carolyn, I'd like to give you an opportunity to react, and then over to Kosha.
Yeah, I know. So Amy and I have had this conversation, and yeah, no, I don't disagree. And, there's kind of a history also associated when, price like oil is high, the price of oil is high, that some countries that are, non-democratic tend to sort of feel emboldened, right? Tend to sort of use that, revenue to help sort of fund conflict and to sort of take action against adversaries as they see it. Yeah, no, I don't discount that. I think, since we're talking about OPEC today, right? We're talking about the OPEC countries, as Amy pointed out, and Kaushik has, pointed out. You have some countries, the Gulf countries, Saudi, the UAE, Kuwait, they can kind of do a little bit of everything. They can continue to produce lots of oil, and they will continue to increase production as while there's still an appetite in the world for oil consumption. And at the same time, they are investing in hydrogen, they're investing in renewable energy. But I think when you're talking about a Gabon, in Equatorial Guinea, you're talking about some of the other OPEC countries, Venezuela, I think you don't see the same picture. So I think in the short term, they're all going to sort of try to continue to produce in a market that is still taking their product, right? And we're still going to look at probably the next 10 years where we'll see higher demand when we see peak. Lots of debate about that. But I think you're also going to see in some ways a kind of a bifurcated market. And again, bifurcated, not in the sense that, I think you're going to see where countries like Saudi, the UAE, Kuwait, they're going to be marketing, and they already started marketing sort of lower carbon oil, right? It's kind of like who can do the most efficient, lowest carbon emitting oil. We're even seeing it in the United States in terms of, efficiencies. And then, some countries that just cannot afford carbon capture. They cannot afford any of these other sort of technologies that are going to be integrated into production. So the same way that you've got countries that are happy to take Russia's oil, even though, there are sanctions. So I see a really interesting sort of next 10 years in this space, and the geopolitics. And, I think I used to live in Russia. One of the things that's very interesting in light of what, Amy said in terms of hard power, you look at, just Putin's sort of, his when he came into office, the price of oil was very low. It was the late 90s, 2000. Oil was, I think it was like in the teens, right? So while he's been in power, he has seen not only like $147 a barrel oil in 2008, summer of 2008, but he's actually been able to sort of, as Amy pointed out, sort of really fund and weaponize, his economy to take action against Ukraine. So I think it's a very contentious market that we're looking at, and I don't see that it's not going to change anytime soon. I think this transition is a very long one, and I don't see the United States necessarily, to Amy's sort of question as to what the United States should do. I think the United States itself is going to continue to capitalize on its own sort of geographic and geological endowments, for the time that we can, and to use our own natural gas and our own ability to export LNG to help to support Europe, to displace Russian gas. But yes, I think, to Jason Bordoff's and Megan O'Sullivan's piece in Foreign Affairs, it's the age of, energy insecurity. It's a kind of a new type of energy security calculation that I think we're looking at in the years, and I would say the decade ahead. I see Kaushik is ready to also jump in.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I just wanted to kind of say something that Amy said, and could be a topic of the next webinar, Hila, that you guys have, is describe China and America as being like-minded. I don't think anyone's kind of done that for a very long, or said that for a very long time in any of the events that I have been at. But to the point of what OPEC can do and what are their what are what's the extent of the power? I mean, one thing that I kind of now firmly believe, and something that we've kind of written over the last few weeks also, is that this latest set of production cuts is probably the last roll of dice in this cycle of production cuts that started in October 2022. I don't think it's possible or it does not make sense for these countries, particularly the core OPEC in the Middle East, to continue with this strategy for a longer period. unless, of course, this is no longer an economic or oil market decision, but something that reflects a closer relationship perhaps with President Putin and Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman, or kind of questions around that. What happened right after COVID and the April 2020 agreement at OPEC Plus to cut production, I think is one of those events that tells us what is the best that this group could do in an event where oil demand collapses, either falls off a cliff or gradually kind of declines. And essentially, that's the only tool that they have, apart from their attempts to diversify energy sources, et cetera, which kind of they are doing. But in the end, when the Ministry of Energy includes folks who work on oil and gas and solar and nuclear, you can imagine what kind of dominates their conversations. I used to live in Riyadh and have worked with the Ministry of Energy quite extensively in the period when oil was minus 40 and thereafter with monthly OPEC plus meetings. And I can assure you that what dominates their conversations is not the next solar power plant. And what these countries end up doing over a longer period is essentially a very limited set of tools that they have. Now, I also recognize that in the end, they are the least cost producers globally. They also have the lowest carbon footprint, likely. I don't know. But so they claim. If that is true, then it does make sense that the last barrel of oil that will be consumed by us species should come from that region or one of these producers. And they like to take pride in saying that they'll be the last person standing in the oil market. And to me, I'd say, hey, that's great. You might produce the last barrel of oil, but remind me what would be the price of oil at that point in time and whether that makes sense for you to produce that last barrel of oil still. So it's not a trivial problem that these guys in the Middle East are facing. And if there is no easy resolution around this in terms of managing a transition, a collapse in oil production capacity in this part of the region would mean terrible things for the entire planet. And that's kind of something that we just need to be careful about as well.
Just to follow up on Kaushik's point, because I think it's an interesting one in terms of if you think about OPEC sort of strategy to date and the production cuts, of course, with Saudi kind of really in the driver's seat, that they haven't done a lot, right? Today, Brent is at 75, right? Saudi would ideally like to see $80 a barrel oil for its own budget and for its own sort of grand sort of plans for 2030 and beyond. But I think there's also been a little bit of the underappreciated side that I think there was the idea that at this point, because of COVID and because of investment cuts that we saw years prior, that today we'd have a much tighter supply on the supply side. And we've seen increase in US production, increase in Canadian production, increase in Guinea's production, Brazil. So you had some of the non-OPEC countries that have actually been able to increase production to add to supply, which again what is OPEC's strategy moving forward? I would agree with Kaushik that they've kind of used the production cut hand now a few times without the results that they were probably hoping to achieve in terms of the price uptick, even in the face of a lot of geopolitical tension, right? The ongoing war, between Russia and Ukraine, disruptions in the Middle East, and still, you still have kind of a suppressed price. I think because we do have a pretty well supplied market, and that doesn't mean that it's going to continue to be well supplied. But I think for the time being, we're not going to see, unless we see some a larger geopolitical disruption, given the economic outlook for China, we probably are not going to see higher prices in the coming year.
But Caroline,
okay, let me just say,
just kind of
go ahead.
One thing I just kind of wanted to say is that for OPEC or the Saudis to assume that they would cut production and they would not be someone else who would kind of fill up that space is extremely short-sighted. In every cycle of production cuts over the last 40 years, every time OPEC Plus and OPEC has cut production, there has been an increase in supply from everyone else in the world. And to assume that 2023 would or 2022 would be different for any reason, it kind of, at least to me, I kind of don't understand that logic. Of course, kind of demand weakness is a very important part of the equation and pretty much explains why prices are where they are. But to assume that you would cut production and there won't be anyone else who would kind of want to come and take advantage of that space that you vacated is I can't even find an appropriate polite word for that.
So this is what I would say to that. I'm glad that you raised that point, because very important point. So, here's really the question. I was on a conference call, a Zoom call with some very important analysts from Russia and some other producing countries, and they were making these very bold statements about where global oil demand was. And I do think that you have some analysts that have put out, and including OPEC itself, put out these big numbers. And what I said to the people on this call, and then we had this very quiet moment where we talked about, like, how low did I think real demand was? You could keep putting out these forecasts with these very high demand numbers, but eventually, if the demand is not actually there, the oil winds up in storage. And you can't fake it. Like, there's a physical market, you can tell people numbers, and I think OPEC has been very effective, and the Saudi minister himself extremely effective. He's stated that he's going to push speculators out of the market. He's been effective in pushing speculators out of the market, and that helps with market stability in general. OPEC says they're trying to find this Goldilocks price that's not too high, not too low. Again, probably a good aspiration. But the problem is, if everybody's overstating demand, you had this period over the summer where China was stock building a lot, and people were sort of questioning as to why. What was it? Economics driven? Was it geopolitical? They were trying to help the Russians with the cheaper crude. Unclear, I think, at this point what their actual 100% motivation was, but the answer is, can't do that forever. Chinese stock market has absolutely collapsed in the last couple of months. The Chinese are dealing with new ideas about how to fight deflation. And so, we're at this sort of pivotal moment, both for OPEC and for everyone, which is, are we going to be able to keep the global economy stable? How are we going to help countries that have this increased debt load? Especially countries that have suffered loss and damage, countries like Pakistan and Tanzania and others who've had really catastrophic events. And how does OPEC fit into that? Because if they, I think correctly, what I hear when I talk to people from the Gulf is that they understand this problem of headline inflation. They understand that it's important to make sure the banking system remains, stable, and that they calculate all of that when they look at the oil price. That's a good thing if that's going to be the case. And, but in the end, you can keep the market up for 6 months when demand is actually lower than people are thinking it is. But like I said, eventually, if the demand's not there, there will be this moment where it's very hard to keep the market stable, as Carolyn, you and Kaushik are saying. And, if we're at that moment, what does OPEC do? Would further cuts really change the sentiment in the market? They're counting on, if anybody was counting on a bad winter, it's an El Nino year. So in places where there are stock markets that look at oil futures, it's probably going to be mild. So far in the United States, for example, it's been milder than expected, right? And so that just makes it, harder to, keep this sort of image of stability building and build on the success that OPEC's had in the last year, keeping prices closer to their target than maybe others might have expected them to be able to do.
And that's Very spot on. I'd love to dig into that a little more, but I also want to give space to our audience for some of their questions. And although I think we've kind of hit on these points, I want to share this question that's come in. Has OPEC arrived at the point of realizing the need to reinvent itself to become more effective in the evolving energy sector? We're seeing a little bit of both, but I would love to hear from you all.
Well, I think there was, I mean, I think there was a reckoning, right? It's been about 7 years since you've had like OPEC plus. I think there was a reckoning that OPEC, as the 13 member countries, was not going to be enough, right? So where you add on Russia, you add on other countries, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, which interestingly enough is where COP29 is going to be held. So you have now kind of the group of 23. And part of that was to sort of boost OPEC's strength and to kind of give it a little bit more market muscle, to kind of where it could to coordinate some of the production supply, sort of looking at the overall global demand and how to respond. But again, I think you have a lot of countries, Russia, other countries that still will act on their own and will act with their own sort of national interest first and foremost. But I do think that OPEC has been in a sort of a period of kind of its own transition as an organization that isn't starting now, but it's been an ongoing kind of rethink, recalibration. Because I mean, the United States was a very disrupting force for the way that OPEC always sort of acted in the market. But now you have, a country that's producing almost 13 million barrels of oil a day, right? That's, so I do think that OPEC will have to continue to recalibrate its position. And to Kaushik's, though, point earlier, I think some of the instruments that they have and that they've used in the past may be more limited in the future.
Does anybody else want to respond?
So one thing that I'd kind of also add to this is that not everyone is equal in OPEC, right? Kind of there are the folks who can produce and produce more, and then there are countries that have had underinvestment and poor management for a very, very long period of time. And those countries are, in some ways, kind of less and less relevant. So to Caroline's point that, becoming OPEC plus from OPEC was an important piece of the strategy to continue to retain their relevance. There is a fair case, and this might be a kind of a controversial point to put out. There's a fair case for kind of shedding some of the lightweights in the coalition just to kind of make this group more effective in terms of its efficiency and decision making going forward. And the one interesting piece around the last OPEC meeting and the decision of Brazil to join OPEC as an observer to try and, in some sense, I'm paraphrasing here, but to convince OPEC Plus to become more energy transition friendly is kind of an interesting development. We'll kind of see how far that goes, especially with Brazil's own aspiration to increase oil production as well as to hosting COP in a couple of years, and everything else that President Lula is trying to do in terms of preserving the rainforests and boosting their own green credentials. It's one of those things that you kind of suddenly have a left-wing player in OPEC Plus who could potentially be an interesting voice in that room.
So I love those points both for both Kaushik and Carolyn. So I just want to add this one last point because I can't add much to what they've said. Everything they've said is very interesting. I guess what I would say is, if I had a nickel for every time the oil industry writ large has made up a story for itself, and that story every 3 years is that there's some reason why we're not having enough drilling, and therefore we're not going to have enough supply, and therefore the price is going to $200 a barrel, and it's always 3 years away. It's always, we're not doing enough drilling right now, and in 3 years we're going to have this really terrible, horrible outcome. And we never get to that 3-year moment. Well, I mean, sometimes we get to that 3-year moment in terms of prices going up, but that's usually because there's some underestimation of some demand surge that we weren't expecting. Like after COVID in 2021, the economies of everywhere in the world recovered faster than everybody expected. And so oil demand went up over 5 million barrels a day in 1 year, and the market had trouble calibrating that. So, or China in 2006, to 2007, say. Big economic driver for global economy. So, sometimes we have these moments where it looks like those stories are true, but as you pointed out, I mean, that has not been the pattern. The pattern is where it's a cyclical industry. It performs in a cyclical way. Companies say they're going to counter-cyclically invest, but then they really don't. Companies say they're going to have a strategy. OPEC has a strategy, and the strategy works for a while. And then when we start to get towards the downside of the cycle, if they've raised prices too high, they say we're going to know when there's demand destruction. We'll know when to pull back. But do they believe their own stories about there not being demand destruction from, digital or from clean tech? Because I think part of the problem is there has been a lot of demand destruction that they don't recognize. So, Bloomberg New Energy Finance and others have done these estimates that actually global oil demand would have been 1.5 million to 2 million barrels a day higher in the last 2 years, but for the high absorption of EVs. And now there's this story going around in the media that EV sales are way down, but actually that story is incorrect, not only in the United States, but globally. EV sales are way up this year and are going to be a record year in 2023. So the story that, we've hit the wall on EVs and nobody wants an EV anymore, that story is not true. 1 in 4 new cars in the state of California, which has 93,000 charging stations, are EVs. So, part of it is whether or not the oil industry and OPEC are willing to get out of their echo chamber and look at real data and make decisions based on real data.
I think that's an important note because I recognize that we only have about 5 minutes, and I would love to end kind of on a positive note. And although not an OPEC country, I think Colombia is a very, very interesting example of a traditionally like fossil fuel based economy in some ways, putting in place a plan to transition. And I know, Amy, you earlier mentioned, there is a difference between OPEC plus countries. You have the Gulf countries who are already starting to think about that transition and have the means to kind of fund that transition. But I think the Colombia case is interesting in particular because it shows that it is still a lower middle income country that is making those plans. So what opportunities do you see, or how do you see this kind of example playing out for other OPEC plus countries that might kind of see the light in that way?
I mean, it raises interesting questions because there are countries that have already made that transition, like Dubai, not a country, but Dubai. And then also, to some extent, Malaysia and Indonesia have sort of moved out of the sort of oil exporter economy to a different kind of economy. And I think that the leaders, political leaders and civic leaders in Colombia really wanted to get off the treadmill of having the economy be good when oil prices were high and bad when oil prices were low. And they really are, thoughtfully engaged in the idea that they have to chart a course on their economy that is disconnected from this volatile oil price cycle.
Yeah, but just to add, but you also have countries, like I think Colombia is one, I think Indonesia is another, right? Dubai, where we were seeing a peak in terms of production, right? Where 100%. They were kind of at a place where they didn't have an upward trend in terms of their own ability to produce. So I think it's a kind of a reckoning with the realities in the ground, right? And then needing to sort of think about how they diversify and how they move away from the fact that they're not going to be seeing the production that they had seen in the past. So I think Colombia is kind of a case in point, and where you're also not getting investment money, like foreign foreign investment in to the space, but also that they're, to Amy's point, that they're all sort of seeing the bright writing on the wall that, better to do it now and to do it in a kind of a more thoughtful way than to sort of be caught, where it's
and while you still have some oil revenue to help you diversify to something else. I mean, I think that's really a lesson for all of the OPEC countries, right? Is that instead of just, raising credit card debt, buying to keep your income level at the same level, it's like, how do I plan for the future, right? And I think Colombia has shown an inclination to want to do that. Whereas you have other countries that are, very head in the sand, and thinking that, I mean, it's just, if you're a country like Nigeria and you think that your way you're going to build yourself out of your problems is by forcing the whole continent of Africa to endorse natural gas and then, being obstreperous within OPEC and at the climate meetings and so forth. I mean, that is not going to be a successful strategy for the nation, right? And what is your economic plan, not only to diversify and move away from patterns of the past, but also to cope with increased costs and damages from climate change, which, a lot of these countries have.
So I know that we're about a minute, but I want to give some space for some closing remarks. And I think, Kosha, you wanted to say something. Over to you.
I just wanted to kind of add to what Amy was saying, that this is kind of front and center in terms of what most energy leaders in each of the OPEC countries wants to do: manage a transition away from fossil fuels, so they kind of, in some sense, future-proof their economies and are able to still have young people employed in high-paying jobs in a world where the world is kind of not consuming as much oil and gas as it used to. The question, of course, is how quickly can you do that? I mean, for the Emirate of Dubai, it took the 2008-9 crisis to make the transformation, and about 10 years to make the transformation since then. I mean, essentially today, if you kind of look at the text that came out of Dubai, the Dubai COP, we are kind of asking OPEC countries or oil producers or fossil fuel producers in general to kind of make that transition in the next 2 or 3 years. That's a much harder task when 80% of your economy depends on oil revenues, or 60% of your economy depends on oil revenues. And then when you kind of get to countries like Nigeria and Angola and Algeria, which have historically kind of done much poorly with managing their hydrocarbon sector, they are just kind of trying to make sure the lights stay on in the capital city tonight. A much more urgent requirement than looking at where the energy transition conversation will be in the year 2030.
Well, I know that we're at time, but I really want to express my deepest appreciation for this panel and its very fascinating conversation. I feel that we could go on for hours, but I hope to continue it in some way and form. And so I thank you all, and I wish you all a wonderful holiday season. Hope that you can take some time off.